Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for coming, and I want to thank our really remarkably expert and distinguished panel for being with us this beautiful Friday afternoon in New York City. I'm Merit Janow, Dean of SIPA, and we really have a very significant interest here at SIPA on matters of global economic and political governance, as well as on the internet and technology policies. So this is a fantastic occasion for us to be engaging a subject, I think, of growing international economic and political significance. We had a global conference this last May on internet governance and cybersecurity. And at that meeting, I note that Professor Laura DeNardis, who was with us then, noted that there was no single system of internet governance. It's an ecosystem that involves different systems around critical internet resources, standard setting, interconnection, and many others. And I think it was a very interesting comment, but it reminded me that what was once primarily a fairly technical area of engagement is now one that really is involving many diverse stakeholders and interests, including national governments, the private sector, the academy, of course, civil society, and the technical community around what internet governance really means. But there are a number of important forums where this is being engaged in a concrete way, and today's discussion we framed as the high politics of internet governance, which is being played out in several forms at least. Certainly at the United Nations, and we'll hear importantly about that, including through the Sustainable Development Goals. I think in the ongoing discussions around the transition of U.S. oversight of the internet governance through the Iono transition, and you're seeing more digital issues entering into trade agreements as well. And note that there was a digital chapter in the just concluded TPP negotiations. I think our Tech and Policy Initiative is trying to engage all of these dimensions, what's occurring nationally, internationally, and globally. But we have with us today a remarkable group of individuals who have been really very much involved in the UN World Summit on the Information Society, WSIS, and what has occurred in the subsequent 10 years since it was inaugurated, and two ambassadors who are very much playing an important role in the review process itself. And let me just briefly introduce, and I will not do justice to your bios, but simply note that we have with us Ambassador Jānis Mažeiks, who is the ambassador at the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Latvia, who joined the UN in 2013 and has had a very distinguished career, as well as Ambassador Lana Nusebe, who is ambassador at the Permanent Mission of the United Arab Emirates, also appointed in 2013. Coincidentally, where she works on a variety of multilateral priorities. Other panelists include Veni Markovsky, who's the vice president in charge of the UN negotiations for ICANN, who is really an early trailblazer in cyberspace, where he co-founded Bulgaria's second ever internet service provider in 1993 and launched the Internet Society there. Professor Laura DeNardis, who is a professor at American University, and we're very pleased to have her as a senior research scholar with us here at SIPA, who's written many books, important books on internet governance. I think most recently, The Global War for Internet Governance, a Yale University publication in 2014, and is both an engineer from Cornell University and a PhD in Science and Technology Studies. Gordon Goldstein, Managing Director and Head of External Affairs for, I think, probably the largest technology investment firm in the world, Silver Lake Group, and is responsible for all global external affairs. And he's represented Silver Lake as part of the U.S. government and industry delegation to the World Conference on on International Telecommunications. He's also a SIPA alumnus, I'm proud to say, and other parts of Columbia as well. And Ambassador David Gross, partner at Wiley Rhine, delighted to have you with us, who's joined us from Washington today and is really one of the world's foremost experts on international telecommunications and internet policy. He's been advising high-tech companies and international organizations, been involved with more U.S. delegations to telecommunications and internet conferences than I'm told anyone else in modern history. And this must only...
This is all modern.
This is all modern history. So without further delay, what I'd like to do is invite our two ambassadors to start us off really by telling us what is occurring at the United Nations at the international level around the World Internet Conference and where you think this is headed. So thank you both very much. May I invite you either to speak from the floor or from here as you prefer. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dean, for this very kind introduction, and thank you very much for hosting us here. And indeed, what we would try to do together with Ambassador Nosebi is to set the scene for the discussion, because we are in the middle of an ongoing process. There is a reason why we are discussing internet governance in 2015, and that reason is hidden more than 10 years ago, because the World Summit for Information Society process is the most important UN initiative related to ICT and development. And it consisted of two phases: the Geneva phase in 2003, which resulted in Geneva Plan of Action, establishing targets and 11 action lines that guided development in specific areas, and Tunis phase in 2005, which built upon the achievements of the Geneva Plan and resulted in Tunis agenda addressing additional issues such as financing and internet governance. Outcomes of both phases of the summit were endorsed by the UN General Assembly and were set for implementation by various stakeholders of the WISES process. During the second phase of the WISES, it was decided to request the UN General Assembly to conduct its own overall review in 2015. And in 2014, the modalities for this review were agreed after extensive negotiations. It was agreed that there would be a two-day high-level meeting in December 2015, which would mark the end of the 2015 review process. And that meeting is expected to be at ministerial level to adopt a negotiated outcome document. And that's where our role as co-facilitators comes in, because the President of the General Assembly was requested by the same resolution to appoint two co-facilitators for the process, which he did on 1st of June, and we have been working since then. It's been our privilege to be appointed as such. So our main task is to lead the negotiation process that would result in intergovernmentally agreed outcome document. In practice, it has meant extensive work on two tracks. One is the paper track, where we have collected and we are still documenting inputs from different fora on the subject and considering submissions from all stakeholders during various stages of the review process. And the second is the negotiation track, where we conduct preparatory meetings and consultations, as well as face-to-face meetings with interested parties. What is important to stress is that this is not only intergovernmental process. Also in line with the so-called modalities resolution, the process is required to take into account the views of the different stakeholder communities, and what we are also trying to do faithfully. So although the main negotiating power in the WISES plus 10 overall review is attributed to governments, the contribution and participation of all stakeholders to the extent possible is very important to preserve the multi-stakeholder nature of the WISES process that has always been there. And that includes the UN agencies, like specialized agencies like the ITU, that are involved in the implementation of the action lines, as well as representatives from the private sector, civil society, and academia. It is also important to remember in this context that the UN General Assembly overall review is based inter alia on the inputs from other WISE's review events that were organized by UNESCO, ITU, and the CSTD, which stands for, well, the first is dealing with educational science and culture, the second with telecommunication, and the third is Commission on Science Technology for Development. So until June we were in this stock-taking process where there were all the contributions by these specialized agencies producing their own outcome documents. Then on 1st of June we were appointed as two co-facilitators, and ever since then we have been working in this negotiation process on first collecting the inputs from the countries to produce a so-called non-paper, which would have the main principles of the document. We then collected inputs or other reflections of all the stakeholders to the non-paper that we had produced. On the basis of these, we produced the zero draft in mid-September. Sorry, it was released on 9th of October. And then we had the first in-depth intergovernmental preparatory meeting on 20th and 22nd of October, which was following the second meeting of the stakeholders on the 19th of October. So again, you can see that the process encompasses both the government aspect and the stakeholder aspect. So a large number of countries took part in these negotiations or discussions. More than 97 countries took part, and Ambassador Sebi will outline in greater detail on what exactly was being discussed during these 3 days on the main topics of the zero draft, namely information and communication technology for development, internet governance, human rights and building confidence and security in the use of ICTs, and implementation and follow-up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Janow, for having us here. It's lovely to be able to get out of Turtle Bay and come to a very stimulating environment like this one. And thank you for all the panelists for being here with us to hopefully generate a conversation with everybody here, hear the expertise on the panel as well, on how we could also improve our process and take your valuable input into it going forward. I think as a starting point, there's no doubt that given the immense growth and impact of the internet and its values, countries today are much more engaged than ever before and trying to influence where this conversation goes. So I think that's an important starting point to be aware of. Just in terms of numbers, last week's meeting was attended by almost 100 member states who were incredibly active in the course of the discussions. I'm pleased to say they were very constructive and focused. I know that's not how you think of the UN usually, but I promise it was a very constructive and focused discussion that I think really unpacked a lot of the key areas of interest to the member state community, the multi-stakeholder community, on where this conversation is going. Today, as Yanis mentioned, I really wanted to update you on some of the bigger themes that have come out of the discussions so far. And they've really mainly focused on 3 thematic building blocks and principles of the WSIS. One is ICTs for development. 2 is human rights and building confidence and security. And 3 is internet governance, which I know the panelists will be addressing further on in the discussion. Let me take you a little bit through ICT for development. So while many think of the United Nations as predominantly focused on issues of peace and security, a big part of the work is also our work on sustainable development. And everyone agrees that after nearly 70 years, that work remains incomplete, which is why ICTs are so important, and it's why the post-2015 development agenda was so important, including the summit, the Agenda 2030 that was adopted this September by heads of state. ICTs are very important and very interlinked in that agenda. They increase countries' abilities to development. They increase efficiency, effectiveness, productivity. They make them a critical driver for economic development and are even seen as an indicator of development. So harnessing the potential of ICTs for social and economic progress lies at the core of the WSIS review and is the mandate of the UN more broadly. And I just wanted to put that in a broader context. Why is this important to us? Why are we talking about it? Specifically, what is their impact? We've already seen the extraordinary impact of the spread of ICTs around the world. So from 2005 to 2015, the number of mobile phone subscriptions has risen from 2.2 to 7.1 billion users. And by the end of 2015, 3.2 billion people are expected to be online. That's 40%, over 40% of the world population. And of these, 2 billion of them are in the developing world. So the scope for improvement is enormous, and I think the impact that will have on development is equally important. Additionally, mobile broadband remains the fastest growing market segment. In 2014, the estimated global penetration rate was 32%, 4 times higher than it was in 2009. And I think a number of countries will tell you, therefore, and this explains some of the arguments that you hear from member states, this isn't broke, don't fix it. Let's keep going the way we are going, because it doesn't need overregulation, it doesn't need government interference, it needs less. But despite this progress, other countries will tell you the digital divide, the gap remains too large between those with internet access and those without. And in 2013, estimates that 60% of people around the world lacking internet access, and particularly women, seem to be the most affected. Only 37% of women are online. So I think it's interesting that the gender topic has come up a lot in this WSIS round. I think it's reflecting the numbers. Only 80% of online content is available in only one language. So a number of calls are coming out of member states for making content more linguistically sensitive and relevant to culture. Looking at the reasons behind the digital divide is also a high priority for member states and multi-stakeholders in this review. So within countries, this involves discussion around enhancing women's education and participation in ICTs as users, entrepreneurs, and leaders. Or, for example, how to make the internet more accessible for people with disabilities, particularly the visually impaired, so that no one is left behind. However, as I've mentioned, merely having access to ICTs is no longer the indicator that the developing countries care about. They care about the quality of that access. How fast is it? How culturally relevant is it? How does it impact their daily lives? So technologies now have to be affordable, they have to be relevant, they have to be available in different languages, and this is becoming the new indicator in this discussion that perhaps wasn't so prevalent in Tunis and Geneva. So I think there is strong potential for the synergies between the newly adopted 2030 agenda, in particular the Sustainable Development Goals, with the WSIS. Most stakeholders agreed that WSIS should capture the important leveraging and cross-cutting roles that ICTs can play in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. There was generally universal consensus around that point. There are also strong calls that the WSIS review process should feed into the SDG review process over the coming 15 years. That's a review process that will look back at what was adopted this September and see how we've done as the international community in achieving those goals and targets. And that would ensure a longer-term relationship between the internet, an important tool and driver of development, and the global development agenda itself. The two are very interlinked. I'll move now to the second thematic, which is human rights and building confidence and security, specifically the themes of human rights and cybersecurity. The ongoing review process has highlighted the need to give further attention to these issues, partly because of their interrelated nature and partly to reflect developments over the past 10 years that simply were not prevalent 10 years ago. We are now seeing conversations around cybersecurity today much more frequently than we saw them 10 years ago. It's just the nature of how the world has evolved. The human rights aspects of the WSIS discussions focus on the need to facilitate the internet as an infrastructure and media for expression, empowerment, and innovation. But the security aspects of the debate, on the other hand, relate to ensuring that national jurisdiction, national priorities, national security concerns are also taken into consideration. So the agreement that we come to during this review process, if at all, will have to balance between concerns around privacy, freedom of expression on one side, and cybersecurity or terrorism prevention on the other, which are equally important to a number of member states to warrant a frank conversation and exchange. So in our view, finding equilibrium between the principles of human rights, sovereignty will be especially valuable given the UN's pivot towards the SDGs and will be an important part of this WSIS review this year. The third issue is internet governance. The internet has evolved, as Dean Janow has said, into a global infrastructure, and this has to be reflected, for many, in its governance structure. WSIS has played a crucial role in raising awareness on internet governance issues. A number of member states are talking about it in the room. In 2005 in Tunis, the Internet Governance Forum, the IGF, was created as a platform for all stakeholders to discuss internet governance issues. The mandate of the IGF formally ends this year in 2015, and member states will have to determine its future. The ongoing negotiations show that there's a broad support for the extension of the IGF mandate, and that's a very positive thing, with greater participation from developing countries. So more countries want to be brought into this conversation. In the ongoing WSIS Plus 10 review process, the question of multi-stakeholder engagement and the resulting roles and responsibilities of stakeholders remain at the core of the debate. Member states acknowledge the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach, where governments discuss internet governance issues with stakeholders from the private sector, civil society, and the tech community. But there are differing views to the extent of multi-stakeholder engagement, as well as views on the differentiated roles, with some preferring a leading role for governments, some preferring a leading role for the stakeholder community. So I think that's a debate that will not get resolved in this review process. It's certainly one we will see go on for many years to come. And in fact, there might not be a one-size-fits-all approach. Different topics may need the attention of different stakeholder groups depending on their areas of expertise. I'm going to stop here. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the themes that have been unpicked in the discussions so far, and as they fit into the wider debate on internet governance. We have far more expert panelists here today to tell you about that. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you both very much. I think that was a wonderful introduction for us, and I'd like to now turn it over to each of our other panelists to offer their own comments and perspectives. I think we'll be mostly focusing on the internet governance dimension, but other comments are also welcome. And I think to the extent, may I invite the other panelists to also, who wish to comment, what you see as the fault lines here. We've already heard reference to some views around the central role of governments. There's also the question of the role of the UN itself, private interests as well, how this can contribute to a process going forward. There's a great deal we could talk about, but without further provocation, let me invite Professor DeNardis to lead us off.
Thank you very much, Dean Janow, ambassadors, colleagues, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. When you think about WSIS, the review, it's amazing that 10 years have gone by. That's a really long time in internet years. So I think the first observation is to just ask the question, well, what has changed over the last 10 years? We can't understand challenges in internet governance without understanding challenges and changes in the technology. So what was happening in 2005? The Facebook was founded at Harvard. The domain name youtube.com became activated, and the United Nations had its first report on the Internet of Things. But since that time, we've had the rise of things like drones that are connected, and Google Glasses, and Reddit, and Facebook, and the NSA surveillance revelations, and the Egyptian internet outage. Like, so much has happened in the last 10 years. Every sector of the economy, our digital economy, is completely dependent upon the internet to function. And people are dependent on the internet. Think about the Syrian refugees. I've been very interested to see that the one thing they all take is their mobile phone. Because as the ambassador said, the internet now has around 3 billion people. This will soon grow to 5 billion. And much of this growth will take place in the developing world with people accessing the internet on cell phones. Just one more comment about something that has changed. And I'll say it in a provocative way, that the internet is no longer a communication network. It's also a control network, in that more things than people are connected to the internet. We have every kind of device imaginable, including industrial control systems, cars, and weather sensors, and every other kind of device. I could set my home alarm from here. So that's a big change. These technological changes have effects on internet governance. And I would say that, I know we're going to talk about the future of internet governance, but I would say that one of the great internet governance problems of our time is to figure out, in the context of these changes, how do you account for human rights and also have security? Governments and private corporations are collecting data about us. There's a lot of censorship. There are reports that prove how many access problems there are. It's not just about the technology, but about impositions that prevent us from accessing things. how do we have human rights and also be able to protect security? And then just one more provocative statement, I would say that the reason this is such an interesting area is because internet governance has become a proxy for state power. So who controls the critical internet resources, who controls points of interconnection and other aspects, even standardization, it's a very powerful form of economic and political power in the 21st century.
Thank you very much. Gordon Goldstein.
Thank you, Dean Janow. Wonderful to be here back at Columbia. I want to pick up on the theme introduced by our eloquent co-facilitators. Great diplomats define daunting problems in understated ways, and I think that was what we observed in these opening remarks. At the heart of the debate in the WSIS, and even preceding the WSIS by many years, is a question about the role of states in the governance of the internet. And it devolves, I would argue, to two different words, which connote two different concepts, two different prevailing paradigms for the present and the past in the internet and what its future might be. Those two words are multi-stakeholder and multilateral. The internet evolved as a product of the multi-stakeholder community. The technical community, civil society, and the private sector. It was essentially unregulated and had a non-governmental character, as it continues to have today. Increasingly, though, a large number of states, arguably a majority of member states in the UN system, favor a contrasting system of internet governance, one based on the multilateral system, which implies explicitly an elevated role for government, not just with respect to questions of global public policy, but the control of vital institutions that make the internet work, like ICANN, the control of critical internet infrastructure, and the future of how this remarkable global network will evolve. In the contributions to this WSIS process, member states submitted draft papers that captured their vision of the future of the internet. One remarkable submission came from China in the G77. The G77, of course, is now a much larger group. It's a body of 134 countries. And they quite explicitly called for a future governance system based on a multilateral model as opposed to a multi-stakeholder model. That view was also part of the tension that was prevalent at an important conference 3 years ago called the World Conference on International Telecommunications. It was held in Dubai. Ambassador Gross and I had the honor of serving on the American delegation there. The US position, shared by the Europeans and other allies, was that that conference would not attempt to encroach on the prevailing model of multi-stakeholder governance of the internet. This conference was designed to update the rules of the road for international telephony had not been updated since 1988, a decidedly pre-internet era. The conference crashed and collapsed on the penultimate night when that line was crossed. A measure was submitted at 1:27 in the morning and passed that would elevate the role of a UN body, the International Telecommunications Union, for the development of future evolution of the internet and key questions of internet governance. That treaty became a highly disputed geopolitical event. The United States refused to sign that treaty. 54 countries followed the United States, but 89 countries signed that treaty. So that tension between those two blocks, those two different paradigms and worldviews, was established 3 years ago. It continues today, and it is at play in the different submissions and discussions and arguments that are going on in the background to WSIS plus 10. And as our very eloquent co-facilitator has explained, it is quite unlikely that this conference will resolve those issues, but it will be yet another event in a broader narrative as the prevailing governance model of the internet is debated and disputed, and that process will probably go on for several years.
Thank you very much.
I've got dueling microphones here. This is always a challenge. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dean, for inviting me to participate on today's panel. I have to tell everybody that I always love coming back to Columbia, not so much because I'm a graduate of the law school here, but rather because so much of my early life was spent here. My dad was a physics professor here for about close to 40 years. So when I'm coming here, it's much really a coming home for me. I think I'm here in part, although I'm actively involved in these issues, I have some historic perspective. I had the honor of leading the U.S. delegation to both the 2003 and 2005 phases of the World Summit on the Information Society. So I have seen the sausage making of this process for a long period of time. And let me tell you that we as a community and as the UN as an institution and globally are very lucky to have the two co-facilitators that we have. They participated and led our discussions last week at the United Nations, and they and their staffs who are here as well did a masterful job in a very potentially difficult situation of trying to forge consensus to downplay the potential areas in which countries often find themselves at sharp odds and focus really on things for which we can all constructively move ahead. Let me assure you that that is a hard and difficult process, and we're very lucky that our two co-facilitators are so masterful at doing that. Let me also say a little bit about the look ahead. I think one of the issues, as we know, we're going through a review, a 10-year review, as our co-facilitators indicated, 10 years after the 2005 second phase of WSIS. And reviewing this state of play today is extraordinarily important for the reasons that Professor DeNardis outlined. Technology changes, the world changes. It's important to take stock. But one of the things which I think we need to be very careful about is that we don't just continue to go on the way we have, but rather we need to ask ourselves collectively, as well as individually, core questions. One of those core questions, and Gordon, I think, teed it up very nicely, is what ought to be the role of the United Nations on these issues? Now, I don't think anyone doubts the importance of the United Nations with regard to taking technology, including the internet, and using it in a variety of ways for the betterment of mankind, development, human rights, and the political and economic and cultural issues that are inherent. But there is a significant and important question about where issues of internet governance ought to be discussed and decided. The world does not lack for places where that discussion is going on today. And that's underscored by the fact that internet governance is not singular, but rather is a whole host of a variety of different issues, whether it's security, human rights, technological issues, and the like. And so the question really is, as all institutions should ask themselves, what are the core competencies of that institution? What ought they to be doing? Because we all live in a world of limited resources, both in terms of time and financially. My sense is that the United Nations is the right place to reflect the technological developments and to use it for the betterment of mankind. But at the same time, I do not believe that the United Nations, in terms of its operations at Turtle Bay, is the right place to have serious substantive decisions made about the technical and policy issues associated with the internet itself. There are other UN-affiliated organizations, ITU, UNESCO, and others, that are very active in this area. There are many other institutions, both global and regional. Now, having stated that, I think we all need to be very sensitive to the tension that what happens with regard to internet governance doesn't just affect those who are already on the internet, but rather affects those who will come onto the internet, and particularly those in the developing world. And in making these decisions and evaluating these issues, we need to think carefully and sensitively about where smaller developing world governments and their people should and can go. They don't have the resources to go to all the places the US, Europe, Russia, China, and others go to. And so we need to be sensitive that we don't hide the ball by having so many places to have so many substantive policy discussions that it is impossible to hear their voices. But similarly, we need to hear the voices not only of states, but importantly of the private sector, civil society, the technical community, and others. So as we look ahead, I think we all need to ask the tough and important question, where, who, and how should these issues be discussed? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I invite Benny to speak.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. And going back to what David was saying, I appreciate being at Columbia University also for some family reasons. My grandfather's memoirs about the concentration camp he was sent by the communists was published first at Columbia University back in '84. So that's my small connection to you guys. But and I appreciate it, actually. The issues, and I come from Bulgaria originally, and the issues that we discuss here in internet governance, English being my third language, is that in many countries of the world, when you say internet governance, internet can be translated, but governance has no interpretation. It has no interpretation because it usually relates to governments. So the moment you say internet governance in certain languages, you already assume that this is the work that the governments do. So we have discussed that in length in the technical community, the civil society, at the WSIS, where I actually first met David in 2003, and at the Wikit, where we also, I was on the Bulgarian delegation. And the question is that people get confused. They say internet governance, and some people from different cultures, they think one thing, and others think completely different. And then on top of that, you also have several people with, again, lengthy knowledge of the internet governance issues, namely two of them who served, one of them continues to serve on the ICANN board, George Sadowski and Bertrand de la Chapelle. Bertrand was a French diplomat who was also around the WSIS and the ITU conferences. They came with the idea that it should be actually not internet governance, but it should be governance of the internet and then governance on the internet, to make things even more confusing for countries where the word governance is translated as governments only. So whether you talk about governance of the internet, which is about how the packets are moving around the networks and what are the, like something that ICANN does, or it's governance on the internet, where how we adopt things that existed before the internet was created and we adopt it to this new tool of communications. For example, crime, financial issues, etc. Consumer protection. We have to address those things, and there are so many places that in a way the UN is yet another place where such discussion is going on. Now, the difficulty of the internet is also that people who are in countries where there is internet access, they take it for granted. Like, your mobile device is connected to the internet. You would never, I'm almost positive that none of you, and if somebody here has actually ever called the phone company to thank them that the internet is working on their mobile device, can you raise your hand? Yeah, I thought so. I never do. But if something is wrong and you don't see the bars, and you know, you will find another phone and you call, or you will email them and say what's going on. So we take this for granted, and the reality is that the majority of the people are not online. Even though mobile phones are, and I agree that, you know, you see even in the biggest crisis, people, and in my native Bulgaria, we've seen refugees who are having, and you know, just they have their mobile phone, smartphone, and they buy a SIM card from the country so that they can have access to the internet to stay in touch with their families and to find ways to move on. We have to be aware that the way the internet has become this kind of utility, maybe, if I use the right word, like almost like electricity or water, is that because it was developed on a, as to quote Vince Cerf, I think, was saying that this was a laboratory experiment that ran out of the lab. So nobody was actually expecting that this will be what it is. And by the way, it's a coincidence, but yesterday is the day when the internet first was created. On the 29th of October, the first TCP/IP connection took place. So we are aiming into a situation where the governments came in late. We had, if you gentlemen may remember, at the ITU plenipotentiary meeting in 2010 in Guadalajara, there was a gentleman, elderly gentleman, who spoke and said, well, colleagues, let's remember that in '95, when somebody came to the ITU and offered us, the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, to take over this internet thing, we told them, oh, there is no future in this, so we have our own communication, X400 was it's called. And everybody was laughing in the hall because this was 5 years ago. But the reality is that things have moved way much faster than any legal framework or anybody has ever expected. So how are we going to address this, both as technical community, but also as civil society, academics, and governments? That's the important question. And the role of the two ambassadors here who have great expertise in diplomacy will be really much bigger than they probably would admit it, because depending on the outcome of these negotiations in October, November, and December, and on the document that the ministers are supposed to accept in the UN General Assembly in December, we can move in several different ways. So the question is, what exactly will be the way to move forward?
You're stopping there, Veni?
Well, I actually have the answer, but I have signed an NDA, and I can only reveal it on 16th of December.
Okay. Well, I guess one of the questions that, that someone like myself who doesn't spend my life inside of these issues as much as you asks is, well, what are the dimensions that are immediate? And what are the ones that are kind of more longer term that are being engaged? And so, of course, we have this issue of the Iono transition itself. And so I wonder if this process is really engaging that. And then what are the sort of critical aspects going forward where we could expect, that the UN would really be able to play a powerful role. And I'd just like to open it up to whomever might want to get us started on that. I think, I see Veni would like to speak another second while others are considering.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to ask how many people know what Iono means? Okay, a few. So Iono is a function of the internet which ICANN is performing. And it's the distribution of IP addresses and domain names at a very, very high level, so everything after the dot. And it's a very small function, but it's a very important function of the internet, so that, and I'm explaining it for you guys to understand it, I'm not going to go into technical details, but it was initially ran by a single gentleman, John Postel in California, who was actually supposed to be the first ICANN CTO in '98 when ICANN was founded. Unfortunately, he passed away young. And right now, what we are doing at ICANN is, in a way, much upgraded version of what he used to do single-handedly. The coordination of the domain names and the IP addresses, the technical coordination is important because you want, no matter where you are around the planet, you want to be able to access your own website, or when you write a website, you want to make sure that you are at the place where you want it to go, not at some other place. So it's more of like an address book. The Iono transition that the Dean was talking about is a process which was initiated by the US government a year and a half ago on March 14 last year, where this function is still maintained by ICANN, performed by ICANN through a contract with the Department of Commerce and the NTIA. And the US government, which initially, when ICANN was founded, was planning to step out of this stewardship role, as we call it, They wanted to step out much earlier, but then last year they said, you know, we think that the community is now already mature enough. So they asked ICANN to convene a process which includes hundreds of meetings around the planet with, I would probably say, tens of thousands of people engaged, with a lot of paper documents written to create a model what the coordination of these technical parameters of the internet would look like when the US government is not around. And the US government role is really stewardship, as we call it. It's a clerical role. There is no influence between the government, the US government and ICANN, or vice versa. It's more about to make sure that ICANN is following the policies which are developed by the broader community. So ICANN has a very complicated structure, and I don't want to take a lot of time here, so I'm not going to go into details, but you can go to icann.org and check it out. But every policy that ICANN performs around this coordination is developed through a bottom-up process. So it's impossible. Our CEO keeps on joking, but he's actually right, even though it's a joke, that he cannot change the type of the coffee in the coffee machine without opening a policy process, so that the community tells him whether he can use a different type of coffee. We are very public. Everything that we do is out in the open and on the internet, and you can check out everything. So this transition actually is how the internet will be coordinated once there is no government to check whether we are following our policies, and that's the really most important task.
So,
Merritt, if I might, though, just to augment what Vinny has described, the transition is not without conditions.
Oh, yeah.
There are stipulated some core conditions that have been articulated by the Commerce Department for the transition to be effectuated. One, ICANN will, and David, you might help me out on this if I skip one of the conditions. ICANN cannot fall under the control or be politically captured by any international organization, including but not limited to the United Nations. ICANN cannot be controlled and must remain independent of any member state or group of member states. And the accountability structure for ICANN going forward must ensure the security, reliability, and stability of the internet. Those are very challenging and stringent conditions to meet. And the system, the dialogue around it, has been extremely vigorous, but is yet still indeterminate, that those conditions have been defined with sufficient clarity for the Commerce Department, for the United States government, to certify that the transition is going to be effectuated.
okay, well, thank you very much. I think we've heard, some very interesting comments about assertion about what the UN is good at on technical and policy along some areas, but at least a question raised about the extent to which the UN is decision-making around in real time around certain kinds of issues. That point was made. We've heard the view expressed that governments, that there are different views amongst governments on what their role should be with respect to the internet itself. I wonder if we could just invite all panelists to make one final intervention before opening it up for questions on what you think are policy shared concerns, if you will, or policy interests, as well as fault lines around this process. And of course, our ambassadors have the impossible task of managing this process, so we understand if you only want to talk in general terms, but should you wish a final comment before opening it up, we wouldn't want to deny you that.
Okay, well, I'll give it a short. Well, first of all, I think it is important to remember there is not one single UN in this matter, because there's UN General Assembly where we are engaged, and then there's UN specialized agencies and a host of different working groups, and each of them has its own role to play, and so the answer might be different depending on which angle you look at. When it comes to UN General Assembly, where we are more engaged, I think that there is more or less an understanding of shared interests. It is more a matter of degree on how exactly these shared interests should be reflected, in which areas you would like to see more government role, in which areas you would like to see more of the other stakeholders' role. So perhaps that could be the way I would look at it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just following on quickly from Yanis's point, and I think Ambassador Grossman, you mentioned this, the UN really is unique as being the only place where you sit with countries who, unlike us, and we have perhaps over 100 missions around the world, some countries have 5 or 7. And their the key place where they come to ensure that their voice is taken into account is the United Nations in New York. And that's where they send their top diplomat, often staffed by just one other person. You go through some of these missions and there's literally a small cubicle, which is the office of one of these small developing states. But they engage in these debates very actively because they can, and they're here, and they don't have the resources to go around the world to all the other mechanisms that are ongoing. So I think it's important to bear that in mind when we understand what the beauty of the UN system is in terms of its universality and its legitimacy. If it didn't exist today, there is no way we would get consensus amongst member states to recreate it. So we do have something very precious in what it is, and I think making it work and more efficient is something important for all of us. On the specific process, bringing that broader perspective into the specific process, I think one of the fault lines that I'm seeing a lot of division around, of course, has been referenced as these two paradigms of government control, if you like, or government influence versus freedom of expression, freedom of speech online. I think for a lot of countries that revolves particularly around the developing landscape over the last 10 years. So we didn't have the types of terrorism acts we see today around the world. We didn't have recruitment online to extremism, which everyone agrees is something that we need to tackle, but no one understands how to approach in terms of their own national laws which protect fundamental expressions online. So there are a number of issues that are much more complicated than just saying we're for freedom of expression online or we're for controlling it. There are a number of issues that come out of the much more difficult security environment that we see today. An easy one that everyone agrees on is child pornography and preventing that online. But then where do you draw the line of controlling online content becomes a much more contentious debate. So I think these are difficult issues and they do need to be discussed. That's one argument for why the discussion should happen at the UN, is because I think a number of member states are there and are present. Thank you.
I think we can tell that the internet doesn't just run itself. There's a whole system of internet governance ranging from control of the technology to interconnection, these various policy issues that have been mentioned today. And I think it's important not to take the internet for granted and also not to take the systems of internet governance for granted. I want to extend what Veni said. There's governance of the internet, there's governance on the internet, and there's now, unfortunately, also governance by tampering with the internet. So we see a system that's been working, and we increasingly see efforts to change the technical infrastructure to achieve certain kinds of political results, whether that is building backdoors into encryption or having data localization laws that have political motivations for where information can be stored, or using the domain name system, which translates between names and numbers, to enact censorship, enforce intellectual property rights, and other things. These are major changes. So I think many of these things are contributing to a loss of trust in the internet. So what I would like to put forward as the theme is, how do you have a commitment to openness and trust given all of these challenges? So I think it's just the point is to not take the internet for granted, and to also not take the complicated, multi-layered system of internet governance for granted, with the eye of keeping the internet open, have the possibility for a universal internet, and to have permissionless innovation so that anyone who wants to connect to the internet can, and also do business on it. Thank you.
One of the wonders of the internet is it connects us all immediately. And I just noticed I received an email from a relationship in the US government thanking me for acknowledging that there are conditions to the Commerce Department's transition and that they will be enforced. Government is watching. I'd like to associate myself with the perspective articulated by Ambassador Gross about finding the appropriate venue to debate and develop the appropriate structures related to internet governance. I share the view that while the United Nations plays a vital role with respect to development and other aspects of information and communication technology, it is not and should not be the arena in which these questions are ultimately decided. It should not be decided in the General Assembly. It should not be decided on the basis of majority vote. We need to be imaginative and creative and find other structures to address these questions.
Although Gordon and I did not obviously rehearse this, I was going to say something very similar. I think that the point that the ambassadors have made about the universality of the United Nations is critically important and should never be underestimated. When you travel to countries around the world, particularly in the developing world, obviously, it is a source of legitimacy. It is a place for people to exchange important information. It is an extraordinarily important place for all of the world's major issues, including internet-related. In fact, I will tell you, when I learned something very early on, there were a lot of interventions in the run-up to the 2003 phase of the World Summit, in which people asked about the legitimacy of ICANN and the Internet itself, saying that it had never been endorsed by the United Nations. And I have to say that I didn't understand for a little while, not being a trained diplomat, that you needed the UN's approval to do this. And of course, that's not really what they were saying. But the fact that the world takes as a source, a basic tenet, that the United Nations is an appropriate arbiter of what is and is not legitimate and appropriate, needs to be recognized and is an extraordinarily important global phenomenon. Having said that, the United Nations is also, at its core, and one of the great strengths of the United Nations at its core, it's a multilateral meeting of governments. That's a very good and important thing. But that also suggests, when you're talking about internet governance, where and in what way, in a non-subservient approach, can the private sector, civil society, the technical community, and others come and be with governments in a way that is collective. My sense is that we need new thinking in this area. We need creative thinking. The old analog approach of having to have meetings where everyone physically is present versus using virtual ways and others needs to be further explored to allow the world to gather in appropriate ways. And I think this is going to be, for the next generation, a challenge, an extraordinarily important challenge. Let me just also quickly mention, the importance of this is not academic or diplomatic. The world really depends on how this comes out. I'm sure you all read this past week at Freedom House, having issued its annual report. It says, in essence, that I think it's for the 5th straight year, the amount of freedom on the internet continues to decrease. That's a global phenomenon, and that's something of importance to everyone, because everyone's ability to use and benefit from the internet depends upon everybody else being connected and be able to freely use it as well.
Final comment.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry for keeping the people away from the questions, but we did develop through the years of experience, obviously, we developed a map, and we call it the 3 layers of digital governance. And I think it's important to understand that internet governance does not mean that the current existing organizations are not part of it. It's actually that there are 3 different layers. So if the lowest level is the infrastructure level, so this is basically where, for example, the ITU is part of, because they are dealing with the telephone numbering and stuff like that, and the GSM associations and others. Then you have the logical layers, which is what ICANN and the Internet Engineering Task Force and others do. And then you have the top layer, which is the economic and societal layer, where you have everything else that's happening on the internet. So the question is really where And I'm sorry, the IETF is actually in the lowest level because these are the standards that run the internet. The question is how to explain better that everyone has a place in this digital governance map, and everyone's place is already defined. And if somebody wants to move, they can do that. Like recently, if in the beginning the Internet Engineering Task Force was mainly engineers from the US because the internet was created here, it was kind of natural. Recently, you know, these are people from around the world. And this year, we actually had for the first time diplomats from the UN who went to an IETF meeting, and they were fascinated by the fact that this is completely different from the UN. But I'll end up with that.
Thank you very much. Time is short, but if we have questions, let me collect one or two and see if we can have a quick response. Let me start by asking if there are any students who have a question here. Not seeing any, let me, yes, in behind, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Hi. So I was a fellow last year with the House Energy and Commerce Committee and got to exposure to the .com Act, and I'm curious as to how that was interpreted by the international community and the current state of affairs today.
Let me collect one or two others. In the front row, yes?
I wonder if we're not looking at the past and not the future.
Okay.
The internet has given rise to the netizens. So there's a world of people, but none of us mentioned how they're going to participate. And if we don't have the participation of the netizens, we lose the force that is the propelling force for the internet.
Thank you very much. Question, if you didn't hear in the back, was about the denizens. How do we get netizens? Netizens. How do we get the
That too.
people? How do we get the people who use the internet into this broad world? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to focus on the WSIS process and ask first how the modalities are going to bear out so that there ensures a multi-stakeholder process for the next month and a half. And then the cybersecurity section I noticed in the zero draft was much enhanced. I don't see a fundamental divide between human rights, security, but the cybersecurity approach must be people-centered and how that can be.
Okay, and I think there was one question over here. Yeah.
Okay, there are multinational corporations that control more resources broadly, people, money, other countries as well, than are some countries. So what role do they have and should they have in that?
Thank you. And I think, ma'am, last question.
I wanted to ask the co-facilitators, in the non-paper draft, it said reaffirm the vision of a people-centered, inclusive and development-oriented information society defined by the World Summit on the Information Society, WSIS, as well as the objectives and norms established in Geneva Declaration of Principles, the Geneva Plan of Action, the Tunis Commitment, and the Tunis Agenda for the Information Society. And that was quoted a lot in the period running up to the statement. And I thought what was important is it said vision of a people-centered, and a lot of the delegates, a lot from the different countries and from civil mentioned that, the vision of a people-centered, and that was the vision that came out of WSIS and helped J.C.R. Licklider with the vision for the internet back in the 1960s. I'm wondering why that has been taken out and other things have been put in the zero draft, but it just seemed that that had a lot of support, and yet that came out of, that was the first item of the preamble.
Okay, thank you. I think it's very important to hear views here. Even if time doesn't allow a complete answer of all of the ideas expressed here. So let me just invite anyone on our panel. I think our co-facilitators should respond to those aspects and others on the other points you wish.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll take a step at two of them. And I apologize if I didn't get completely right the question about human rights and cybersecurity. Basically, there are two subsections currently under internet governance in the zero draft, and there was rather broad support in the discussions last week to place them somewhere else. Where there were several options expressed, either under the section of information communication technologies for development or as separate sections in their own right. That discussion we will still continue to have, but these elements are there. With respect to the issue of non-paper and this vision, it is still there. If you look at the zero draft in the paragraph 4, we still reaffirm our common desire to build this people-centered, inclusive, and
It doesn't say vision, it's
You can follow up offline.
yes, but basically it is there. It is direct quote from the previous documents. In fact, that has also been one of the important parts in our work, not to skew the perspectives that have been agreed upon at previous occasions, so that we would be just picking some part of the quote. So I think this is more or less direct quote from those documents.
Other responses to any of the comments? Thank you.
I think this question of how everyday people get involved in internet governance is a really important one. The term netizen was used, civil society, citizens, because so much of what we talk about is technologically concealed. It takes place in these institutions. It takes a tremendous amount of money to travel to institutions. There are a lot of barriers to participation. But we've also seen activism on the part of citizens that have affected change. In the United States, fairly recently, there were boycotts over the Stop Online Piracy Act, for example. There was also a lot of activism around net neutrality. So we see examples of that. But I also want to say that the multi-stakeholder model is somewhat of an answer to that question. Because when you have institutions like the Internet Engineering Task Force, in which anyone can participate, even though there are these barriers to expertise that are money, expertise, culture, et cetera, having that open avenue for participation is a very important part of the governance mechanism. Moving from that to where one stakeholder would control the dialogue, especially a multilateral approach to any aspect of controlling the internet, would be a major departure from that. So even with all of its problems, the multi-stakeholder model at least provides some openness for citizens to get involved.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank all of you for coming. It's great to see you here on a Friday afternoon, and I do want you to thank this fantastic panel for coming up from Washington, from breaking out of meetings going on at the United Nations. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel.